Welcome to episode 14 in the KIPS Personal Trainer Application Podcast. My name is Tyler Valencia, and I'm the president of KIPS and Kettlebell Concepts. Today we have a great topic that every fitness professional can utilize immediately after. That is circuit training. This episode's guest is Dr. Tony Nunez, who is an assistant professor at Metropolitan State University of Denver. He's a presenter on the Fitness Speaking Tour and has been in the fitness industry for 10 years. In this episode, we dive into current recommendations for circuit training, differences in the application of circuit training, and the future of circuit training research. Let's jump into the episode. What are some of the common misconceptions you've seen / heard when it comes to circuit training?
Probably one of the biggest is that you can't increase muscle size with circuit training. Circuit training is pretty much viewed as like a muscular endurance type activity. That's really going to help build muscular endurance and cardiorespiratory endurance, which is true. Research shows that both of those things do occur when you engage in circuit weight training for long durations, meaning like an actual training, 8 weeks, 12 weeks. But there are other studies that show if you have the resistance high enough during the circuits, that you can still increase not only strength, but size. And then a lot of the exercise physiology research more recently shows that if you're going to failure, you're going to elicit, or you're going to have a response of hypertrophy or increase in size. So as long as you're following that kind of guideline, you can still see different types of results with circuit training.
Yeah. I think when I first thought or even was told about circuit training, it was being an introduction into personal training and coming into a gym setting, and basically my fitness manager said, oh, you could set up this circuit. This is a great way to attract clients. But really, I feel like there's still not enough information out there for trainers to be able to utilize this information. I think it's a great way to get a quality workout in with a client, but also a great way to give them several different, or introduce them to several exercises. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. And it's very time efficient, right? So
Exactly.
if you're working with a client, and I know a lot of personal training programs have moved to 30 minute, right? It used to be the traditional 60-minute training session. Now some people pay for 30 minutes. Well, if you only have 30 minutes to get a workout in, you're going to want to be as time efficient as possible. So implementing a circuit-based program is probably a really good way of doing that. And it really depends on what population you're trying to look at. So with circuit training in, say, athletic performance, circuit training traditionally has been something that they do in the off season. That's kind of something to keep them active and engaged. And they might even build it into in-season training because it's not as stressful. But it never was traditionally used in the preseason program, which is where you're trying to build strength and power. So if you're looking at that population, maybe it'd be better to do something more traditional during the preseason. But for general population, just your gung-ho people working out at 24-hour fitness or something, it's a great way of getting them started and just introducing them to a different way of just your traditional one exercise, 4 sets and move on, because that tends to be pretty monotonous and pretty boring for most general population. And they don't really adhere to it as much, with the whole idea of exercise adherence is that people are going to come back and continue to do it. And you really want that if you're trying to improve overall health and wellness.
Yeah. Two things popped up in my head with that last part right there. Well, one, very good points in terms of programming, depending on what population you're working with, athletes, and how you can structure this into a whole year's worth of training with your client if they are an athlete. But second, I think going into what's interesting for the client, I think that's something that we often forget as a personal trainer or fitness instructor. There's this level of give and take, giving them stuff that they want to do or that will keep them entertained. Because if you don't have anybody to train, you're not going to be a personal trainer. You're most likely to be on your way out of the industry. So keeping them entertained is such a crucial part of personal training. And if you just gave them your favorite ones all the time, they might be great exercises. They might be very foundational exercises, squats, some type of pull press, some type of hip hinge. But if they don't really like them, if they're not entertained, they might move on to a different trainer.
Yeah, definitely. Keeping the client in mind is a big part of getting clients to adhere to your programs. While we know based on research that doing anything is going to help improve your health and wellness, right? Now, there are other ways or other things to take into consideration when you're trying to say improve it at the best. Or let's see, what's the better word of saying that? If you're trying to create a program that's going to be most optimal, right? Mm-hmm. Even if it's most optimal for these 5 people, it may not lead to any adherence for another 5 people, meaning that they're going to drop out.
Yeah.
And if they drop out, then it's all for none, right? Even if your program was the most sound scientifically, if it's not getting people to stick with it, then there's no point of even trying to implement it, right? Yeah. So there's this whole idea of translational research and making sure that it actually translates to the populations that we're trying to get to do it.
Yeah. So today on the podcast, we have Dr. Nunez that has done some extensive research in circuit training. And I think one of the areas that we got to kind of go back to is the programming, implementing a circuit. I think that by now, personal trainers, group instructors should know that individualization is the key, making sure that you're not just handing the same template out to each client and saying, hey, go jump on this circuit. They will have a different load. Their fitness level might be in a different place. What are some of those physiological characteristics that you would recommend to a personal trainer that they make sure they check off or make sure that they're looking for?
So when looking at all of the research and seeing what the typical circuit weight training program looks like, recommendations over the last 40 years have basically come down to a few different principles, and that is that circuits should be performed for anywhere for 2 to 4 sets. So as you go through it, or 2 to 4 rounds, depending on what terminology you like to use. So as you go around your circuit, you should do it at least somewhere between 2 to 4 times. Usually it should have somewhere between 8 to 20 repetitions for your exercises, or anywhere from 15 to 45 seconds if you're using a time-based, right? So a lot of people like to do a time-based circuit where you stick with your exercise for, say, 30 seconds, and you just get in as many repetitions as you can in those 30 seconds. So 8 to 20 tends to fall between the times of 15 to 45 seconds is usually what we see. And then your rest period between exercises, usually somewhere between 15 to 60 seconds between exercises. And then you can do another 60 seconds between rounds is usually what they have. And really that 15 seconds is a transition period, right? So as I stop squatting and let's say I'm moving on to my push-up exercise, it usually takes me about 15 seconds to kind of decompress, walk over to the station, and then begin the next exercise.
Yeah.
And then if you're using actual external loads with your circuit training, which would be circuit weight training, then usually the recommendation is somewhere between 40 and 60% of the person's 1RM. Not too many people actually know what their 1RM is, right? So not too many people actually do 1RM testing in the gym. But usually that's the equivalent of like an RPE. If you're using the 6 to 20 scale of an RPE, somewhere between 12 and 14 or 12 and 15 of an RPE 6 to 20 scale, or if you're looking at 1 to 10, usually it falls somewhere between like a 5 and a 6. Okay. So those tend to be the recommendations for circuit training. But like I said, going back to what we talked about in the beginning, if your goal isn't, and that's really for health and wellness, right? So you're trying to improve cardiorespiratory endurance and you're trying to improve muscular fitness, just general muscular fitness. No real goal of increasing strength or size or increasing endurance. It's just general overall mobility in certain movements. So those tend to be those markers. But if you're trying to build strength, then you really have to gear your guidelines towards strength. Or if you're trying to build hypertrophy, you need to gear your guidelines towards hypertrophy.
Good stuff right there. Really good recommendations. And something that popped up into my head was about diminishing returns. I know that common questions client might have if you're doing a circuit with them, and if they are really motivated or they are at that point where like, okay, I really need to make a change in my life, they might come up and ask a personal trainer, hey, like, can I do another round after we're done? If they only have a 30-minute session, or if they're, even if it is an hour session, they might come and ask, can I do another round of that circuit? Will that have any benefit? Have you seen anything in research that are talking about diminishing returns, or even what would your recommendation be for that?
I think it would really come down to how many days per week the client's exercising, and
Hmm.
if that tends to be um, something that's continuing to occur, because you wouldn't want them to overdo it, right?
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
the idea of overtraining really comes from the principle of under recovery.
Hmm.
So if a client isn't taking enough time to recover and really get their passive rest, getting the proper nutrition in, and all that stuff, then you would want to pay more attention to uh, their questions on, can I do more? Can I do more? Right? Like,
Hmm.
because you don't want it to lead to overuse, injury, and overtraining, right?
Yep.
So um, there certainly are diminishing returns. It does take quite a bit to get there,
Hmm.
unless the person is just really malnourished and really not taking care of themselves in terms of sleep and rest and recovery.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it's something that you want to think about on a client to client basis, and really understand your client more and what their goal is
Yeah.
with their program. If they do ask, just kind of take those things into consideration. Maybe you feel they can do another round, and you decide, you know what, lighten up the load a little bit, do one more round, but after that, just try to get in some stretching and recovery so that you don't injure yourself during the program.
Good
And then one
point.
thing that I forgot to mention was exercise selection during your circuit, right? So if you are implementing all the appropriate exercises, meaning that you're hitting all the major muscle groups, um, and you're doing so in a fashion that you're not seeing overuse from one exercise to the next, then you should be able to create a program where they might feel like they can do another round just because they're not really getting that fatigue that they would experience if they're doing multiple sets of the same exercise.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I thought that that was such a good point, that depending on the client and then also their recovery strategy, those are often things that building those in with a new client, or even, I would even say the majority of individuals that you will see in a personal training setting, they have no idea. I mean, you as a personal trainer will often see a client 1 to 3 times a week for 1 hour. So 3 hours total in a week. The other times, what are they doing? What are they used to? What do they know? Are they implementing any type of stretching outside? Are they are they incorporating any type of sleep strategy? I mean, what does their diet look like? These are all things that often, as a personal trainer, you have to work these in with them, and almost in a similar fashion to personal training or strength training, that you're gradually increasing these types of things, bringing one thing at a time, making sure that they're adhering to them. Just because if you just throw everything at them, I'm gonna throw everything at you, do all your extra work, there's a chance that they might not do any of it, or it might just be overwhelming for them. I mean, I think that's something that we've kind of touched on, is that every client is kind of, or they are different. And so having a individualized approach to all these things, it's something that you got to uncover with each client, making sure that you're not implementing the same things with each client, because they might have different goals. They might have different backgrounds in exercise. So I think that taking that individualized approach, as you mentioned, is such a crucial item right here.
Yeah, yeah. And when you think about like people who just like to burn themselves out during a workout, right? They want to take it so hard that they don't want to do anything at the end of the day because they work so hard during their workout. Well,
Hmm.
there's definitely some disadvantages to that we've seen in the research. People who tend to do that tend to be less active throughout the day after the workout, right? So they
Mm.
tend to lounge a little bit more. And really, what is that doing for you? It's decreasing your caloric expenditure just from your leisure time physical activity. So it takes away from the overall calorie burn for the week. And when you think about it, if you're only working out 3 days a week for 1 hour a day, That's 3 hours in a week. And we all know that that's not a lot of time.
Yeah.
Right. In the grand scheme of things. So really, where does a majority of the caloric expenditure come from? From the activities that you do during your leisure time. So are you spending a lot of time sitting on the couch after you work out? Or do you make it a point to walk a little bit more and be on your feet a little bit more? Because that's really going to lead to the body weight changes that you want to see from a program, if that is indeed your goal, is to improve your body composition, right? So what you see is people will come back and be like, yeah, I've been doing this program 3 days a week, an hour each program, and I've been kicking my own butt the whole time. And I can't see any results. I haven't lost any weight. I haven't done this. And what you actually start to notice if you look at activity trackers, what the research has shown is that activity tracker data shows that these people tend to be more sedentary after they do their workouts, which just takes away from their overall caloric expenditure for the week. And that's going to be very detrimental to their ability to lose weight over time.
Very good points. Very good points. I think that also goes along those lines of, creating a lifestyle, a more positive lifestyle. And I think that point right there builds right into that. I like what you said about if there are people, and what you pointed out with research, that are just burning themselves out, just all about high intensity. And what are they doing when they go home? Just on the couch, surfing, channel surfing. So really good information there. And so a little information on how this podcast came together, this episode right here, because I think it's really useful. And something that even caught my eye was that Dr. Nunez created this presentation for the ACSM Health Summit around circuit training, and something in there that we might not even think about as a fitness professional, as a personal trainer, is how can circuit training be incorporated in a rehab setting? I thought when I saw that bullet point, I had to ask that in the podcast, because that's something that many of us will just glance over or not even think about, just because we typically associate some type of circuit training as high intensity or something that's fast paced. But what have you uncovered in the clinical setting with circuit training?
There's really great research out there on cardiac rehabilitation patients implementing circuit training into their exercise programs, and they've seen amazing results with it, even in comparison to just general aerobic training. So you would think, okay, the heart's responsible for the aerobic side of things, right? It's going to get the blood pumping for the aerobic activities that are more continuous in nature. Well, with the just overall prescription of a circuit, since it does keep the body moving and it does engage in those different muscular fitness activities that you may not see with cardiorespiratory exercise, cardiac rehab patients really respond to circuit training style. And it doesn't have to be, like you said, that fast pace on your feet, moving at high intensity at all times. I mean, when you think about a cardiac rehab patient, high intensity for them might be 40%, right? Yeah. That might be high intensity for them. And their perception of how hard that is. So when you implement just these different exercises, like I said, going back to the whole exercise selection idea, making sure that you're getting in all the muscle groups, all the major muscle groups, and you're having them do those movements properly, it really does benefit not only the muscular fitness, but the cardiorespiratory fitness and just the overall function of the heart. Mm-hmm. And when you think about that, you can move that into different clinical populations, whether it's diabetics, whether it's hypertensive individuals, even looking at people coming back from injury. It really just comes down to how you select your intensity, how you monitor your intensity, and making sure that you stay engaged in the program so that the person is doing everything properly. Yeah. Right. So they're going through appropriate ranges of motion. They're using good dynamic principles in terms of eccentric, concentric contractions. One big thing that we think about with cardiac rehab and muscular fitness is that when you do resistance training, you can see Valsalva maneuver taking place, right? So the Valsalva maneuver, which is that period between the eccentric and concentric action where someone may hold their breath. Mm-hmm. So when they do that, it really causes these crazy increases in blood pressure. And that's not going to be good for someone who is undergoing cardiac rehabilitation. You don't want to see too high of change in blood pressure. So you just have to make sure that those people aren't engaging in the Valsalva maneuver. So they're going through smooth, controlled movements as opposed to really holding their breath and pressing for the concentric phase.
Yeah. Good points. Really good points, and interesting stuff there for any personal trainer that is working with a patient or a client in that type of setting. And it really, opens up the door for programming, in my opinion. How we kind of pointed out there is we might not come to circuit training as an option just because we think that they can't handle it or it might be too much for them. But just how you pointed out, their percentage of exertion, their 40% might be high intensity for them. That's such a good point there that we kind of we went over, but it's such a crucial point and really taking into account their individual fitness level. Really good stuff there. Something that's been kind of going through my mind as we're going through this podcast is the use of different types of circuit training, or even, and we can of course go through the popular ones, but what are some of the differences, in your opinion, of circuit training, high intensity power training, or even HIIT, which is right now a very popular term to use?
Yeah, so circuit training originally just spoke towards different muscular fitness movements, sequenced in a pattern where it was repeated in a cycle, right? So high intensity power training, I actually had to look that up before doing the podcast, because I have never seen that in the research. And where I look at for like fitness professionals, I started noticing, okay, so essentially they're implementing power movements, right? So we're thinking about like rate of force development and impulse when we think about power. So how fast are you moving the weight, or what type of movement are you performing to actually elicit the power? And the idea of power training, I mean, is there's always a backing of high intensity. So I just thought it was interesting that they called it high intensity power training, because power in and of itself is high intensity, or you would think of it as high intensity. But it's an interesting approach. I would say that when you think about what gets me, what it gets me thinking about really is kind of a CrossFit type style workout, right? High intensity power training. So that's immediately where my mind goes. And what I've learned and what I've seen in the research behind when you're implementing a kind of power program is that you want it to be high intensity, but you don't want it to be muscular endurance high intensity. Meaning that you don't want to be doing too many repetitions of the power movement, because now you're just increasing your likelihood of injury due to overuse or due to a breakdown in exercise form, right? So proper form. Usually as you become more fatigued, form becomes diminished, and then that can lead to an injury due to that movement, where that potential may not be there if you just properly implement the power training. Now I have a colleague, Dr. Fury Yeto. He's over at Kennesaw State University. He does a lot of research on CrossFit style workouts. They call it high intensity circuit training. And if you're interested in that type of stuff, I would certainly go over and read his articles, because he comes up with a lot of information. Now you have to take everything with a grain of salt, because Yuri is a big CrossFitter himself, so there's obviously some inherent bias there. but you hope that he's undergoing the normal scientific format of his research, and I know the man very well, so I would say yes, I trust that he's doing his due diligence with the research. Now, when you think about HIIT, high intensity interval training, when I think about HIIT, I think specifically about implementing high intensity bouts of aerobic style training, with lower intensity bouts of aerobic style training. But a lot more research is kind of implementing the whole idea of resistance training built into that, which is why you get all these different terms, right? So you get HIIT, you get HIRT, which is high intensity resistance training. You get HICT, which is high intensity circuit training. So you get all these things, and they're all trying to describe what is essentially a similar format, where you're going hard for 30 seconds or so, and then you're taking your break, and then you're going hard again for 30 seconds or so, and you're taking your break. And how you implement the intensity during the high intensity portion and how you implement your recovery is going to change your results for your programs drastically. So And there's also HIST. I don't know if you know about that, or sprint interval training, SIT. So sprint interval training is referring to intensities that are super maximal. And what we mean by that in the research is that if we did a VO2 max test on you, let's say we're going to throw Tyler on this treadmill and we're going to see how fast he can run when implementing this graded exercise test. And the point at which he reaches fatigue, that's what we know is his velocity max, or the point at which he reaches max speed at his VO2 max. Well, we know that Tyler can run faster than that if we ask him to sprint. Okay, so sprinting essentially is your ability to attain an intensity above what we would get in a graded exercise test on a treadmill or in a graded exercise test on a cycle ergometer. So sprint interval training has been popularized because you only have to sprint interval for like 15 seconds, 10 to 15 seconds. And you can see just as much benefit as someone doing a high intensity bout at 30 seconds or 60 seconds, right? So it's pretty incredible research that are coming out with the sprint interval training. And as we all know, I mean, you go and you look at, say, an Olympic sprinter, they looked pretty jacked, right? They're usually pretty jacked when you look at them. And you think to yourself, okay, is that all just from the sprinting? Well, we know it's not all from the sprinting, but there is certainly a response that comes from doing that type of training.
Yep.
Another colleague of mine is doing the sprint interval training and actually seeing that you do see improvements in muscle hypertrophy from doing an aerobic type exercise for a sprint bout. So like a 10-second, 15-second bout. Because just the sheer amount of force application that it takes to go at those higher intensities is really going to engage the fiber types that are going to be more susceptible to hypertrophy. So you're going to see those type of improvements, which is pretty cool.
Good stuff. Really fascinating stuff that you shared there. And something that I think it's fun to jump off of there with is the sprinting. And if anybody is listening here and they go on Twitter, I'll say strength coach Twitter, just in general, I'm not pointing out any specific strength coach, but if you go on there, you see a bunch of people that, why are these people not sprinting? Sprinting. And the issue that I have with sprinting, and I'm not trying to discount any of the research that we were just talking about, but the chances of injury when sprinting, depending upon the individual, are so much higher. You're exerting your maximal force in a run, in a sprint, and depending on your client, if you think, okay, wow, this is really fascinating. This is really fascinating what Dr. Nunez is saying, and I'm going to go apply this. Make sure that your client has sprinted before, the last time they sprinted was not 5 years ago or when they were a child. Make sure that you build them up for it. And that has always been my issue when I see strength coaches trying to talk about sprinting, just because of the athletes that they're working with. They are so well trained that they can sprint multiple times a week and be able to replicate that over and over. And that's part of their sport. That's part of their training. It's built into them. But a lot of clients that we see, they're not. They have probably not sprinted in years. So make sure you take those precautions. Yeah. I had to throw that in there.
And yeah, definitely. That's a good point. And a lot of the research, like you said, is going to be done on the start of this information is typically done on general population that are apparently healthy young adults, right? You're usually working with college age individuals when you're getting that type of research started. And then you kind of, once you understand that, okay, it's healthy and it's not going to injure anybody in this population, then we can start to spread out and get into those other populations that may not be as in depth at sprinting, right? Like you said, people that haven't done it, maybe never did it in their life, maybe as kids, they never actually even sprinted in their life. So the implementation doesn't necessarily have to be on your 2 feet either, right? So like you don't have to be on a track doing wind sprints. You can be on a cycle ergometer, right? And let's say this person is doing, you can do a makeshift graded exercise test on a cycle ergometer. I remember I used to do that a lot when I was a personal trainer. We wouldn't be collecting any kind of gas information or heart rate information necessarily. It was just, okay, let's gradually increase your intensity on this bike by increasing the resistance and having you maintain a certain pedal rate, right? So if I keep revolutions at, say, 70 RPM, I'm just going to gradually increase your resistance every 30 seconds. And the point at which you can no longer maintain your revolutions, well, that's going to be your peak, right? That's your max point, we'll call it. And now when I have you implement that sprint training on the bike, I'm just going to go a couple of resistance points over that and have you try to go above that typical revolution point. Now, you're definitely less susceptible to injuring yourself on a cycle ergometer as you are to, say, going on and sprinting all out effort on a track, right? So people are going to end up injuring themselves, usually due to the deceleration portion, not so much due to the acceleration portion. And on a cycle ergometer, you tend to be less susceptible to injuring yourself that way. And like you said, you have to build up the fitness level.
Yep.
There has to be some base, right? And that can't be the be all end all. You really have to mix it up. So that's one good way of training, but it's not the only way of training, right? So that's one really good thing to implement in your cardiorespiratory program, say once every 2 weeks, but it shouldn't be 3 days a week. That's where the overuse injuries come from. And people just tend to over implement those type of programs because we know that they're so good, they're so beneficial when they are implemented, that it gets over implemented and people come back and they just start complaining about these little nagging injuries that weren't there before. And then you realize, oh, what did I do differently while I implemented this sprint interval training? And we've been doing it, all out for the last 2 or 3 weeks. So that tends to be an issue with that type of training program.
Yeah. I like a lot of the things that you said right there, because I think it ties into almost a theme of the whole episode with mixing your usage of different modalities in. How you mentioned how not just sprinting, I mean, you could use an ergometer, you could use a rower, you could use different types of equipment, and even thinking about your programming and how what you have access to. Are you going to be taking your client to a track, or is it easier to go into the gym and utilize some of the equipment there? And how are you going to keep it interesting for them? If you're just taking them to a track and you're just having them sprint, they didn't want to invest their money in that, or if you can mix it into a circuit and utilize it as a part of the overall program. Here's some more ideas that just opened up. Look at how many more options you have with your programming, which I think brings me to my next question about, and I know you've already mentioned some of these already, but what would you say some of the fundamental programming guidelines you would give to a personal trainer in terms of sets, individualizing the program? What are some of those items that you would recommend for them?
Well, like you said, it comes to individualizing the program. So you really want to look at the client specifically. So if you have a client who's just starting out, a lot of research is showing that you can actually just implement a single set program and still see results with a resistance training program. You can still see the results, assuming that you can get them to a point of volitional fatigue. So you're not saying that they're reaching the point where they can't sustain their proper form, but you're just saying that, their last repetition feels pretty diminishing, right? It's like, oh man, that was pretty tough. And when you think about for just a beginner, I mean, that might be 12, 14 reps in. I don't know how many people actually try to do those traditional muscular endurance programs, but when you try to do 20 consecutive repetitions for an exercise, it's hard. Yeah. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who you are. Yep. That's going to be pretty tough if you're implementing it in the proper way, right? So, in terms of recommendations with sets and reps, I mean, for the beginner, anywhere from 1 to 3 sets is perfectly fine. If you can find a good resistance where they can perform anywhere from, like I said, 12 to 14 repetitions, that's great. They're still going to see the added benefits and giving them. I know we want to implement like these really cool strategies right away because it's going to be fun. It's going to help engage them. It's going to help bring them back. But you still want to think about, like you said, going into like, what is the appropriate way of doing this so that I'm not going to injure the client and I'm going to get the best results. And that tends to be more of your traditional style in the beginning because it helps them build the neural pattern, right? So the movements, they may have never squatted before, or they may have never done a push-up. You put someone under a bar for bench press and you notice that they look like a newborn deer trying to walk, right? The bar is just moving everywhere. It can't stay in one plane at all. So you really just want to build the neural pattern by having them repeat the movement multiple times to help build what they call neural drive, right? So where your brain is getting communication to your muscle in a fashion that you would see proper form. I mean, because
Mm-hmm.
it's going to take time to build those movements into the program. So um, I would say that you want to have multiple days built in, but it's not a necessity if the person is just starting out. They're going to see benefits, even if you just do 1 day of resistance training per week for a few weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And then you slowly but surely you start building in multiple days. And then you start improving parameters around the program where you can do increased amount of sets and even lower the repetitions because you're going to be able to add more weight, right? So there's a relationship between all of those things. So if I'm going to continue to add on weight, I can't expect my client to be able to do the same amount of repetitions because the idea is for them to get stronger, and strength comes from being able to perform just a small number of repetitions for a larger amount of load, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just that progress. And I think what we've come up with in the very beginning, so probably things that you and I learned back when we were in undergraduates, that stuff still holds true. Like those foundational programs still hold true. Um, it's just that we're trying to find different ways to implement it so it's more enjoyable, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we get people to come back and really want to do it on a regular basis. But don't forget the foundation, right? Don't forget the
Yeah.
foundations of how to program
Yeah.
and what type of movements to implement. Because I think you mentioned it earlier was like, okay, you always want to have some version of a squat. You always want to have some version of a hip hinge, an upper body push pull horizontally and an upper body push pull vertically. So horizontal push pull, you think bench press and row. Vertical push pull, you think lat pull down, shoulder press. Now, it doesn't have to be those exact movements, but some kind of variation of that movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that you're getting in the planes of motion and you're hitting in all the major muscle groups to get the most out of your program and for your client to get the most out of the program.
Good stuff. Really good stuff. Really good recommendations there. One more question before we get to the podcast takeaways. And since this is one of the areas that you've done research in, what is looking right now, or even what kind of research are you seeing coming out for the future of circuit training?
So the future is really looking like the implementation of these high intensity interval training into the circuits.
Mm-hmm.
So we just published a study earlier this year. It was a sequencing study on high intensity interval training within a circuit weight training program. So we wanted to know, okay, if you do all your high intensity interval training at the start of the program and go into your circuit, is that more beneficial than doing implementation of that high intensity interval training within the circuits or in between the circuits? So we called it, it was like a HIT cluster program where you did small clusters of circuits where you had 3 exercises performed in a circuit format. And then you did 3 HIT bouts on a treadmill. And then you went back to doing 3 new exercises in a circuit format, went back to the treadmill for 3 HIT, and then finished it off with 3 more new resistance training exercises in the circuit format. And that was the program. And that was compared to the same amount of high intensity interval training in the beginning, and then the same number of exercises, 9 exercises performed for 3 rounds. So we equated everything. Everything was matched in terms of time and loading, repetitions, time under tension, all that stuff was matched. And we just wanted to see, does the sequence make a difference, right? How we implement the HIT. Does it change anything?
Interesting.
Yeah. And it really didn't change that much. What we saw was that energy expenditure actually tended to be higher when people did all the HIT in the beginning and then did the circuit for 3 rounds, 9 exercise circuit for 3 rounds, compared to implementing the HIT between the 3 exercise circuits. And what we saw was that it created more of an anaerobic effect, right? So how do we measure anaerobic effects? Well, we did it with blood lactate, right? So blood lactate is a surrogate marker for acidosis. And what I mean by that is that lactate itself is not the cause of acidosis. It's actually trying to help us buffer out what's happening at the muscle. But there were increased lactate appearances in people who did all the HIT in the beginning and the big circuit after. And we contributed that to the fact that the circuit itself was so anaerobic in nature. And when you think about HIT, when you get those lower intensity bouts, you actually get a chance to remove the acidosis that you create or the lactate that gets created in the process. because you're doing a lower intensity bout in between, right? So we were giving them 90 seconds to walk on the treadmill between their high intensity runs. And that gave them time, essentially what we equated to time of buffering, right? So they got time to buffer out some of the acidosis, which they didn't report it making their circuits any better, because we did some self-reporting on, okay, how did it make you feel? Did you feel, like, were you enjoying it? Did it make you feel exhausted? All this stuff. And all those markers were relatively the same between the programs. People didn't really say that they felt better doing one or the other. They did say that they found the implementing of the HIIT in between as more enjoyable and more interesting, probably because not too many people actually do that as it is, right? So they're used to doing all their HIIT in the beginning and then doing the circuit after, because that's how we usually build in that kind of stuff. So it was pretty interesting findings in that regard. So I think that doing more research on that and seeing if there is any kind of training attitude. So this was a acute response study. We're just looking at like what was happening, what were the characteristics immediately after the exercise program. So I think implementing that into a training program, maybe 6-8 weeks, and seeing how people respond would be a good way of doing it. There are some researchers out in Spain and Italy that do this rest pause circuit training. Have you heard of that before? Essentially what they do is they have them do 6 reps so they're still trying to get 10 total repetitions, but they have them do 6 reps to fatigue at a weight that takes them to fatigue. They increase the weight, and then they have them do 2 more reps, and they pause, they increase the weight again, and have them do 2 more reps. So they get to 10 repetitions of the exercise, but the weight just continues to increase as they do it. And they've seen some pretty interesting results with that type of training. But I think they need to do more on it. And it doesn't seem like it seems realistic when you have a trainer who's there to change the weight for the client. But if someone was to be implementing that on their own and trying to accomplish that on their own, it seems pretty cumbersome for them to be able to accomplish that in a single session. So while the results of the studies have been interesting, I think the whole idea of translational science, right, getting it to actually work in the real world, may not be there quite yet. But it is an interesting idea.
Really fascinating. Really, both of those, what you shared, were very, very fascinating, and items for trainers to think about, which I really like, and I really like you sharing those. So really good stuff there. So as we get to the podcast takeaways, and we're going to try this again, as I mentioned a little earlier, Dr. Nunez, he is a PhD level fitness professional, has a master's, has a bachelor's of science in kinesiology as well. So with all that, it takes time, it takes growth within the industry. And in our last episode, we started talking about, I say, different lies within the fitness industry. And really, this is just advice from the point of the guest on the episode. And so, Dr. Nunez, in your experience so far, and the path that you've gone, and you can share a lot of that stuff, please feel free. What are 3 lies that you have uncovered about the fitness industry?
So 3 lies that I've uncovered about the fitness industry. When I think about that question, it makes me wonder if I'm coming at it from more of a professional point of view, like what makes a good personal trainer, or if I should come at it from more of a scientific point of view in terms of, okay, what have you heard in the weight room that's not necessarily true? How would you like me to come at it?
Maybe one of each, and then one of your choice.
Okay. So the biggest lie that I like to say in class, because I teach exercise physiology at Metropolitan State University of Denver, and we have a whole section on bioenergetics. And I kind of got into this when I was talking about my research study, and the idea of lactic acid, right? So I'm sure everyone has heard, oh man, I got all this lactic acid in my muscle and it's really making me sore, right? So lactic acid only appears in the body in very, very minuscule amounts. And it actually comes from the digestion of dairy. It's not really a form, and it comes from our heart musculature as well, but it's not really formed in muscle all that much. What we form in our muscle is called lactate, which is actually a stable form of the molecule, meaning that it's not causing any direct acidosis within our system. So and it's certainly not going to be there 24 hours and 48 hours later. So it's not the cause of the muscle soreness. And the formation of it is really an attempt to help buffer our system as opposed to actually cause acidosis within our system. So that's one big thing that I always tell my students, and their minds are just blown when I tell them that, because they hear it so much in the weight room, right?
I will admit that that's almost an automatic dismissal in my mind when somebody says that. If they're giving a presentation or they're tweeting or anything like that, they're saying lactic acid, I just keep moving on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the next one, let's go with the professional side. So I wouldn't say it's a misconception. I would just say that people should realize that a lot of what makes a very good personal trainer, other than the fact that they have knowledge in the area, is really just being a very good marketer of what you're selling and how you're selling it, right? So like for me, I would never consider myself a great business person, but I really enjoy what I teach, and I really enjoy what I'm selling people. And that's the idea of health and wellness, right? So if you can show that you are really bought into the industry and you're really bought into the ideas of health and wellness, and your clients see that, and people and you know, when you're in a weight room, you're never alone. There are people watching you and watching how you interact with your clients. So when you're showing joy and engagement and excitement for what you're doing, people notice that, and your clients notice that, and it makes them want to come back, and it makes people want to be a part of it, right? So they want to be a part of the enjoyment and the excitement, and they want to know what you're teaching and what you have to say about certain things. So I think that's a really big thing for trainers to learn and to be aware of, especially when they're first getting started, is that how you display your mannerisms goes a long way to how people perceive you and if they're going to want to continue to work with you as a trainer.
Really great point. Really great point right there.
And then the last part, one more lie. I think one of the bigger, and this goes back to resistance training, has to do with hypertrophy, right? And hypertrophy muscle growth. So the whole misconception that you have to lift heavy weights in order to see increases in muscle size. I think there's enough research out there, and it's getting more and more into the industry that's a misconception, right? You don't have to lift heavy to increase your size. What you do to increase size really is to increase volume. So you have to get in enough volume to see the damage that you want to see. And when we say damage, we're talking about healthy, normal damage to the muscle belly, right? We're not talking about overuse and repetitive use damage that leads to something like rhabdomyolysis, right? Where you see bloodborne pathogen in the urine or something like that. So we're talking about just your normal inherent damage with training that leads to a repair process, right? And that repair process allows for the muscle to grow because it's essentially a response that, hey, when I do that again, I'm not going to get as damaged as I did the last time. And your body, in order to actually repair that damage, needs to be properly nourished to get there. So you don't actually see improvements in muscle size directly from the program as much as it is an added effect from you getting in the proper nutrition, right? So you're making sure to eat enough protein, eat enough carbs, take in enough water, get enough rest, so that your body actually is given the nutrients and time it needs to increase that size. Yeah.
I think that's such a great point for new trainers to think about. And the example that I usually give is when talking about bodybuilders. You think about what they do in the weight room and how they look. A lot of bodybuilders, I mean, there are bodybuilders that do heavy weight. They do, amazing things in the gym, but there are a lot of them that just do isolated work, low weight and high repetitions because they're trying not to get injured so they can continue to be in the gym and utilize all the things that you just pointed out there. But yet people think, oh, he's big. He must be super strong. He must be lifting big weights. No, he's not. And so as a trainer, understanding that you just don't always have to lift heavy. You don't always have to throw as much weight at your client. There's different ways that you can program things. And you can keep all the items we talked about in today's episode, keep them coming back keep them healthy, keep them exercising more frequently. All the items that I'll say keep you training clients more, keep you earning more money, which is important. I think that that's such a crucial thing for trainers to think about. So really good points there. I thought that all of them were great. And in terms of things that every trainer will literally uncover while being in the industry within probably their first 3 months. And so
Yeah.
really good stuff there. Dr. Nunez, do you have any upcoming events? I know that at the time of recording this, and you and I were talking about this before we started recording, but do you have any upcoming events where personal trainers can see you speak?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I was supposed to be doing a few different presentations this year, especially um, specifically during this few months. And as we all know, a lot of those things have been canceled. So there's nothing on the docket for this year. At the moment, I'll probably be at ACSM Health and Fitness Summit next year presenting, and I'm hoping to be at IDEA Personal Trainer Institute as well as IDEA World Fitness Convention next year. So keep an eye out for that. If you're interested in all this stuff, I'll be talking about pretty much the same exact things, and hopefully having some more research that's been published more recently to talk about. But other than that, I mean, I'll just be teaching. I'll be teaching my classes.
Good stuff. And can you share your social media information for the listeners?
I don't really have any. I'm probably the youngest researcher to not have any kind of Twitter sphere or Instagram following for that specific information. But if you want to get at me on LinkedIn, I have a LinkedIn. So if you just look me up, Tony Nunez at Metropolitan State University of Denver, you should be able to find my LinkedIn profile if you wanted to get in contact with me.
Perfect. Dr. Nunez, thank you for coming on, sharing really good information that people can apply immediately. That's the big thing for this podcast, is really sharing those tidbits, information that trainers can apply immediately, go with their clients, start using this information. So really great stuff. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, no problem. You're welcome. My pleasure.